Welcome. This is Dr. John DeMartini. This is one of the most amazing and inspiring shows that you can listen into. If you want to be on the edge of your seats, if you want to open up your heart, if you want to expand your mind, and you want to meet incredible people, stay tuned because you're just about to experience a transformative radio show that will change your life. And you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show that's coming up right next.
Welcome to the Dr. Pat Show. Talk radio to thrive by. Powerful, inspiring, and coming to you live, bringing you stories of people like you and me, busting through and living life full out. Get ready to dare to wonder what your life would be like if you knew you could not fail.
Hello, everyone. I am Dr. Lisa, and you're listening to the Dr. Pat Show, talk radio to thrive by on Transformation Talk Radio. Stay with us for the next hour and let us help you experience how to thrive in your everyday life. Everyday people can do extraordinary things, right? Do you think that your experience in daily life are one of spiritual promise? It just may be so. You never know what your light will bring to yourself and to others, especially nowadays where it's really scary out there. People are frightened. They don't know where to go or who to talk to. The pace of life can be really challenging, and we could all use some more tools to focus on peace and living in our society. Well, you are in for a special treat. My guest today is Reverend Dr. Amy Cox. She's a priest, a parent, and a policy scholar, discovering the dance steps to life, according to her Twitter. Thank you for coming on this show, Amy. Can I call you Amy or should I call you Reverend Amy?
You're welcome to call me Amy, and it's a pleasure to be here.
Your example of living, daily tools in living are an attraction to me. And I'm so appreciative that you decided that you would come on the show today.
Thank you. It's great to be here.
Thank you. Thank you. Thank you for being here. Could you give the listeners a little more information about you? I mean, a priest, a parent, and a scholar, a policy scholar. Tell them more information and how you how you got on the path you're on.
Well, it's true. There's a nice alliteration there with all the P's, but I work in a secular job, and I am an ordained Episcopal priest as well. So what does that mean? I direct an office of research at a state government agency, and we do research and data. We do the empirical number crunching that has to do with trying to advance public policies. And before that, I worked at a policy think tank and did similar kinds of things, so that our laws and policies might be based on sort of the best information that we can have available and might become more just and more useful and more effective. And at the same time, I'm also an ordained Episcopal priest. So that means that I have been recognized and educated and trained and formed by the Episcopal Church to be a ministry leader and a pastoral presence and a focal point to try and do the work of the church in our world today. And I balance both of these things with the parts of my life that are not about professions, but about family. And I am a proud parent and step-parent and aunt and sister, and all of those things really inform each other in my work. They're very intertwined. They're not, even before the pandemic, when we had more boundaries between work and weekends or daytime and evening, they're all informing each other in my day-to-day living on a regular basis.
Wow. And that's one of the reasons why I wanted to talk to you today, is because you live a life that is influenced by many different things. And within all of those different areas of your life, I don't think that I heard you say that you were married, though.
I am. I am a wife as well. Yeah, that should have been in there in that family relationships. Yeah, it is. And relationships are such a good example of why all of our lives are intertwined, right? Because relationships are the places where we practice all of these things. We don't live a theoretical life. We live a life in relationship with our spouse, in relationship with our children, in relationship with our friends, in relationship with our boss or our coworkers. And that is where we have some of the biggest rewards and some of the biggest challenges to try and live out our values.
Mm-hmm. Thank you. And so, how did you get? I mean, so you finished all your academic career and then you went into the priesthood. I happen to know you, so I know that this is true.
This is true. And, it was interesting. I was in my last almost year of graduate school. I was in graduate school getting a PhD in sociology, and that's a 6-year journey. And I was in my last year of it, and I was struggling, and I had a spiritual experience that was very otherworldly, and that said, I know you're struggling now, but don't fret in this struggle. The longer term plan is also for you to be a priest. This PhD is not the only part of your future. And I want to speak to that for a moment, because I have great appreciation and empathy for people who are atheist or agnostic, because in many ways in our sort of post-Enlightenment society, it's very easy to be discouraged about the spiritual structures that are out there, the church and other structures, and very easy to think that, this idea of a spiritual life is crazy. And if one has never had striking spiritual experiences, it is even easier to have those thoughts. And for me, I haven't really had that choice in a way. There have been moments in my life, some strong, like the one I just mentioned, and some much more subtle, where it was very, very evident to me in a way that I could not even begin to argue with, that there is more than what we see and taste and hear and touch in this world. There is something bigger and beyond us. And so when I had that spiritual experience, it wasn't the first one I'd had, but it was one of the strongest. And it was very much the kind of thing you can't ignore. But if you haven't had those, it makes sense in a way why it would all seem a little crazy. So I finished that PhD program and then eventually went on to seminary and became a priest as well, even though I was already in the social science world.
What a story, a scientist who becomes a priest. Wow. And your talk of the spiritual experience, I love the way that you frame that for people who, have not had spiritual experiences. And I have had several, and they have knocked me on my butt, so to speak. Like, did this really happen? And so this is a great time for a break. You are listening to the Dr. Pat Show, talk radio to thrive by. And me, guest host, Dr. Lisa, and my wonderful guest, Reverend Dr. Amy Cox, who is a priest, a parent, and a policy scholar, discovering the dance steps to life and helping others do the same. We're going to take a quick break. And when we come back, we will explore more about this fascinating subject. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We're back. We're back on the Dr. Pat Show, talk radio to thrive by. And my guest, Reverend Dr. Amy Cox, who is a priest, a parent, and a policy scholar. But before we continue, we were just talking about your spiritual experience. Can you tell everyone, how could they contact you if they wanted to make a comment or say something about our talk today? How could they contact you?
Well, I have a Twitter and an Instagram that are both public. I would say I'm not super active on social media, but I'd be glad to put that information out there. My Twitter is Amy G. Cox, all one word, at Amy G. Cox. And my Instagram is Preach Amy, PREACHAMY.
Awesome. Awesome. So we were just talking about your spiritual experience, and you're a scientist who had a spiritual experience, and that you were talking about that. That's how you came into the priesthood. And one of the things that I really admire about you is once you became a priest, you always seem to lean into hard topics. And the one that comes up for me, you're an advocate for those who can't speak for themselves. You seem to always lean into how do we be better, including yourself. You use yourself as an example. And what's coming up for me is when Ferguson happened. And can you talk about, like, how do you have the courage to talk about things that are hard topics?
Thanks for that question. That's a good question. I think, well, let me say that I was formed as a priest at a marvelous parish in Southern California, All Saints Episcopal Church in Pasadena. And the former rector there, George Regas, who has since passed away, used to say, you should prepare your sermon with the Bible in one hand and the newspaper in the other. And that really, really resonated with me sitting in the pew before I was a priest, because I had and still have a strong passion for current events and the things happening in the world that are affecting people. And in particular, where injustice is happening in the world and where justice is growing in the world. And so when he said that, it was very almost comforting to me, that this idea that the church is part of the world. It is not a separate entity. It's separate in the sense that in its best moments, it's an example to the world. Although, as we all know, there are many, many moments where it is not an example to the world. But it is a part of the world. And so to preach with the newspaper in one hand and lean into those hard topics is really a calling for me. I feel an imperative to do that because I need the guidance and the hope and the suggestions and the direction of something greater than me to navigate all of those hard topics in the world. And so when I'm preaching, when I have a Bible passage, I'm always looking to see what happened that week or that day, and what first I have to unpack that Bible passage. They were written at different times for a whole different society with a different set of values that was primarily farming. And I have to make sense of what the passage even means, and then wrestle with, well, how can that help me with Ferguson or climate change or the Me Too movement, or the list goes on and on and on, the pandemic currently, of course. So how do I lean into those hard topics? Because I need to lean into those hard topics.
Wow. Yes. We all do need what you're describing, and at the same time, we don't all speak up. Like, that you're called to speak about injustices. I mean, when I was there when you preached on Ferguson, and it was a primarily European American congregation, and I think people were a bit shocked.
Yeah, I think that, and it was before George Floyd, so there was less racial awareness at the time. Not that there was none, but there was less. You know, I remember that sermon and someone thanking me for the courage. And I thought, that kind of surprised me, because in a way, it was courageous, right, to talk about racism in an almost exclusively white European American context. And at the same time, it wasn't courageous, because it was what was in front of us. I mean, it was what was happening. How could I not, right? Or like I remember I was on deck to preach the Sunday after the horrific Pulse, the massacre, the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando. And how could I not talk about that? I mean, we were all grieving it, and to ignore it, to ignore the devastation happening in Ferguson, to ignore the life that had been taken, is to stick our head in the sand. And that is not that I don't want to also stick my head in the sand. Let me say that. Like, I get overwhelmed regularly by the work in front of us to do, by the news, regularly. And so the impulse not to look at it is an impulse I also very much appreciate. And I think we have to be judicious. We have to take care of ourselves. We have to have a community. We have to do many things in order to be able to not stay hiding from the things that are hard.
Oh, thank you. Thank you for that. And so what tips would you have for someone who's listening? There's many challenges happening right now. And like I said before, when you go to talk or preach, you are very, there is never a time that you preach that I have seen or have heard that you don't talk about what we can do today. I just haven't seen it.
Yeah, I really think people go to church for hope and for community and for hope and for community, for lots and lots of reasons, of course, but those are common themes. And how do we have hope if we don't have an action to take? Otherwise, it's just theoretical, right? It's like it's seeing God as a superhero who will come and save the day or something. But that isn't my experience of how God works very often. And so the much more often, my experience is that we are part of creating and co-creating the world in an ongoing fashion. And as Sister Joan Chittister said, reclaiming the Garden of Eden an inch at a time. And so having an action. So for me, I need that sermon to not only unpack what the Bible script, the scripture we just read, but then also to make sense of it for our life today, and then to give me something I can do to advance that love and healing and justice in the world. You know, preachers talk a lot about love, but love in the public sphere is justice. And that's not my idea. I think it's Martin Luther King's and probably other people's as well. And so when we're working on trying to apply those lessons of scripture in our daily lives, they often have interpersonal, in those relationships again that I said at the beginning, interpersonal application. What can I do with this, with the people nearest to me? And they often have sort of community. And by community, I mean both the individual church community, the national community, the global community, your state community. They have community application too. So, and no one person is supposed to fix it. It's not about that. It's about all of us taking actions that move the work forward.
I love that. I love that. The collective we. Well, it's time for a break. Thank you so much. You're listening to Dr. Lisa on the Dr. Pat Show, the talk radio to thrive by. When we come back, we'll continue to talk about how to develop our own personal hope with Reverend Dr. Amy Cox. Stay tuned. We'll be right back. We are back on the Dr. Pat Show with me, Dr. Lisa, talk radio to thrive by. And we have Reverend Dr. Amy Cox here talking about finding your spiritual walk within. Dr. Amy, or Reverend Dr. Amy, can you tell us where people could look for you or look for your sermons or look for things about you?
Sure. I don't have a website, although it's been suggested that maybe I put one up. If I do, I'll put it on my Instagram, Preach Amy, or on my, maybe on my Twitter. I would probably keep it really on the Instagram. My Twitter is Amy G. Cox. So if people wanted to contact me, they could certainly do so in those places.
Thank you. Thank you very much. So we were talking about hard topics, and I know that I have been witnessed to. I have witnessed so many things that you have brought up from preaching about different things. So we may have like the prodigal son story and all these different parables, but at the end, you always have this like to do right now. And so I'm just wondering, two questions. First, for people who are not involved in church, who are, we'll talk about them a little bit in the next session. Like, what do? They may be listening and say, well, I don't have that community. Like, what do I do? So that we'll talk about that coming up. But what are some of those nuggets that at the end of your sermon, there is always something for people to do? There's always an action step. And I heard you say, you take some kind of action. Action is hope, and we co-create in this world. So do you have any examples for our listeners to take away today?
Well, I think there are a lot of them, and it's a really good question, because I think that especially in our sort of 21st century life of social media, it's very easy to, click like or share something, or, and nothing changes, right? Like maybe there's a little bit more awareness, but probably not a lot more awareness given the way the algorithms parse people into only seeing their own community anymore, people who think like them. And so what can we do that's beyond, clicking the like button or the share button of the pithy meme? And I like a pithy meme just as much as anybody else. But after I see it and laugh, well, what do I do then? I think that something is always better than nothing. And that is an obvious thing maybe to say. In the world of math, we note that any number, no matter how small, is infinitely greater than zero. And so taking an action is the more important thing than taking the perfect action. So I would definitely recommend that listeners not spend too much time deliberating. You can always write your government representatives. This actually really matters. You can write your local representatives, you can write your state representatives, you can write your national representatives, and someone reads those letters. It's usually a staffer, but I will tell you that when they get a lot of communication around one area, they notice. And yes, politics, especially at the federal level, are very, very partisan right now, and there are great, great divides. And having those, speaking up in those ways, especially when multiple people do it, does make a difference. And it also makes a difference for you, because now you're not hiding your head. Now, when I'm writing a letter, I'm taking that one action that might be the thing that keeps me from despair about what's going on. Even if the result doesn't change, it has now kept me from despair. And that right there is an impact, right? Mm-hmm. So that is always a possibility. Protests are also really useful actions. There's a lot of scholarship that over the course of history, protests make change. People get discouraged because it didn't change this thing right now. It didn't change this thing this year. But I think last year's racial justice protests, particularly around Black Lives Matter and racism that members of the African American community experience on a daily basis across all institutions in our society, not only the justice system, have made a difference. They have made a difference. We see it all the time. It is the pushback we see. It is the advancements that we see. But racism is a topic of conversation and a topic of legislation in a way today that it was not 2 years ago. And that is the result of those protests. That is what is the result of. And there are many other examples. So those are two examples. Building community with other people is a really important action. And how do we do that? In lots of ways that I can get to in a moment, but building community is a really, really important piece of action, because we can't effectively maintain our stamina by ourselves. Human beings are social beings. We may need alone time and restorative time. Absolutely. And we are not designed to live in solitary, and we certainly can't maintain hope that way.
The collective we.
Yeah.
And co-creating. And so if I'm listening and I'm not feeling great, it's holiday time again. I don't have family, or I'm afraid to have family over because of the pandemic, and I don't know which way to go. I watch the news, and every time I see it, it just makes me more afraid, and a lower vibration every time. I don't see any hope out there, and if I meet people on the street, no one's smiling and or saying um, or welcoming to me. What would you say to that person? What hope would you give them?
I would say, first of all, remember that the news, many sources of news are money making businesses, and they have a mission and about news and journalism, and they also have an obligation to make money, and they make more money when they get more readers, which they do when they spread more fear. So recognize that that is not the only perspective, right? Is the one that you'll see there. So diversify your news sources and bring some in that are nonprofit if you want to keep up to date. But I want to address what you said, Lisa, about the discouragement and hopelessness, especially at this time of year. We have Omicron, we have the seemingly never ending pandemic. We have the holidays, which in a good year can just completely wreak havoc with people's hopelessness. And loneliness. These are real issues. I think the things to do that I would recommend to people who feel really disconnected and isolated and alone is to reach out to someone, anyone. It doesn't matter whom. It could be that college friend you can't remember anymore, that high school friend that hit you up on Facebook 3 months ago. It could be your neighbor. It could be, your grandchild. It doesn't matter. But reach out to someone and spread a little bit of hope yourself. Fake it. It doesn't matter. You don't have to even believe it. Spread something positive, because what that does is it helps buoy you a little bit, right? So one of my favorite tools when I go to a party and I'm feeling uncomfortable because I don't know the people, and all of a sudden, for whatever reason in that moment, I feel like that high school freshman, socially awkward again, is to go find someone and be of service. Just go find someone and be of service. And you can do that within your home, even if you can't go out because of the pandemic. You can text people, you could call people, you could write a card. Someone is sick, or their family member is sick, or someone just lost a family member. Get a card, write a card, doesn't have to say very much, stick a stamp on it and put it in the mail. That is the one thing that I would say more than anything, reach out. So many people are lonely and isolated right now, and they think they're the only one, and it's just not true. The other thing that I would say is to write a list with a piece of paper and a pen or a pencil, not in your head, but to write a list of 3 things that you're grateful for in that exact moment. In that exact moment. Those are 2 concrete actions. And the last one that I would say, so reach out to other people, write 3 things you're grateful for, get outside and get in nature. It doesn't matter what that means. I know it's winter. Get outside and feel a cold icicle. Get outside, look at the sky. Get outside, awesome. Put your feet on the ground, even if they're in boots. Something about being in nature shifts us. Yes. It happens every time to every person I've ever met.
Thank you, Dr. Cox. Thank you, Reverend Amy. It's time for a break. We're hold on. You just got 3 tips. We'll be right back. Stay tuned. We're back on the Dr. Pat Show, talk radio to thrive by, with me, Dr. Lisa. And I have my very special guest, Reverend Dr. Amy Cox, who is a priest, a parent, and a policy scholar, discovering the dance steps to life and helping others do the same. Dr. Cox, you've already told us we can find you on Instagram as well as Twitter. Anything else?
And how to find me?
Yes.
I think that's enough.
Okay. We've talked about so many different things. You've just given us tips on how to come out of despair or how to help ourselves by helping other people, by getting outside, and by, what was the third thing?
Writing some gratitudes.
Writing some gratitudes. Those always are very useful. You also talked about participating in writing letters to local and federal,
Representatives.
Representatives, politicians, about things that are really bothering you. And what you said is, like, once you get it out there, you're actually taking that action. You talked about action being a co-creation, and you talked about many, many things, but that's just a summary if you just start listening. How about creating community? How do we create the community for living the dance of life? How does that happen?
It is such a good question, because we live in a world where we are both more connected than we have ever been before because of the internet, and less connected than we have ever been before because of the internet. And then, of course, now layered on top of it is just this crazy time we're living in with the pandemic, where we see little squares of people on Zoom all the time, but we don't see them in person. And there's just something very two-dimensional about that. And the disconnection that I think so many people feel today has real consequences. It has real consequences for their health, their physical and their mental health. There was some really good research, important research that came out actually before the pandemic even, that talked about the increase in loneliness in the last several years. And I say all this to let listeners know that they are not the only ones feeling this way. In those moments where they do, or those seasons where they do, they are not the only ones feeling this way. It is really a pandemic of its own sort happening in our world right now, this disconnection and lack of community. And the antidote, of course, is to have community, right? But how do we get there, especially if we're already feeling alone and isolated? I think that there's no one recipe to do, but I encourage people to try out lots and lots of things. And it starts really by just building relationships one at a time. And relationships, I think, are built best when people do things together. So being able to have someone that you might go do something with builds that relationship. And then when you invite a third or a fourth person, now all of a sudden you have a whole community. What are those things that we might do? Well, maybe it's saying to someone, I've always wanted to volunteer, to do X, Y, or Z, but I've never really known how to start. Would you want to investigate that with me? Or I've always wanted to write a letter to a member of Congress, but I don't even know how to start. Would you write one with me? What if we both wrote one? Or, hey, I totally cannot focus on this work anymore. I know we're still all working remotely, but could we take a coffee break together? If we were in the building together, this is when I would say, hey, let's go grab a cup of coffee. I totally can't even focus anymore. or if you are working in person, to say, hey, let's go grab a cup of coffee and just talk about stupid stuff because like my brain is fried. You won't be the only person with a fried brain, you know? I think it's part of why people are, it's one reason, not the only one, of course, but why people are so drawn to professional sporting events, because it feels like community even though I don't know these people, because at least we're all here at the game together. We're doing something together. And that's really, I think, the underlying piece, the doing something together. Um, and, you know, I think also, and this is the case about change in the world and social justice, as much as it is about building community. My experience is that we do much better when we simply take the actions and focus on the actions, and we don't keep grading ourselves. We don't look at the results. We let the results happen or not happen, but we keep taking the action and we focus on that piece. Because then what happens is sometimes those relationships build and develop, and sometimes they don't. But when I'm taking the action, that will naturally happen, as opposed to when I'm trying to focus on the results. I so easily can get discouraged. You know, in terms of church communities, there is, of course, more option today than there was pre-pandemic, with a lot of places having services online where you can kind of like check it out and see what it's like and see, might this be a place I might try? That can be really useful. I would encourage people not to stay there forever, but to actually try out a place in person at some point. Christmas can be a great time to do that because there tend to be a lot of new people there. So you won't feel quite so much like you're, you know, like everyone knows you're new, because there will be a lot of new people. You know, I can remember when I went back to church as a young adult and started to go regularly, I was going through a hard time in my life. And I used to go and sit in the back pew and just cry. And then I'd run out right before the service was over. And you can do that. Churches have seen that. You won't be the only one that they've ever seen that before. And but you know, when we do start to join a community, whether that's a community of volunteers or a community of a book group or a community doing you know, our office work or our for salary or for wages work, you know, how we can build community in any place we're in. And we do it by building relationships bit by bit and taking a risk and, you know, having, you know, a list in your pocket, in your mental pocket, of a couple things to talk about. No one wants to talk about the weather anymore. Like we all talk about the weather. Don't talk about the weather. Like nobody, it's like kind of like just doesn't go very far. So, you know, people can talk about, you know, the crazy thing their cat did. People can talk about the crazy thing in the news. People can talk about, you know, thinking maybe I'm going to try a new habit. Do you know how to crochet? I kind of always wanted to learn how to crochet. Who do we know how to crochet? And building those relationships one at a time, that is the thing that breaks down that isolation and builds up that community.
And what I hear you saying is try something, you know, dinner on Zoom, try to, you know, pick up that project where you're sending food to people who need it. You know, send water to people who need water in our country and other countries. All of these things, the service, the co-creation, are part of the community, a community that you can build one step at a time. I cannot believe like it's almost time for us to be over, and it has been a wonderful, wonderful hour talking to you. There were so many wonderful gifts. You're welcome, that were given to our listeners, who can take them and they could do them today. They don't have to wait to make their gratitude list in the moment. They can do that right now. And that's what I love about this, the practical things that you can do. And community is built on relationships. And by having a relationship with yourself and reaching that oak leaf out to your neighbor, to your friend, and just intentionally doing it over and over is the way to start. Thank you
Lisa,
so much.
Could I just say one thing here at the end to pick up on what you said? You can start wherever you're at. You can do deep breathing when you're waiting in line at the post office. You can write a gratitude list when you're procrastinating at work. You can pray when you're in traffic.
Thank you for those few ending tips. Gratitude list anywhere. Thank you. We're out of time, and it went so fast that we ended on tips. Thank you, Reverend Dr. Amy Cox, for sharing this great information about living every day using your gifts. And I want to thank you for tuning in to the Dr. Pat Show, Talk Radio to Thrive By. I had a wonderful time. I want to thank Dr. Pat for the honor of hosting her show. You can join me, Dr. Lisa, every second and fourth Wednesday at 4 p.m. Eastern, 12 Mountain, 1 Pacific, on Living Love and Light, living every day in peace. Have a great day. We will see you back here next time. Thank you, Dr. Cox.